Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. Off the coast of Argentina, our island's midst the deep, with 1,800 people and 500,000 sheep. The day they were invaded, everybody learned the name. A barren little colony had got a bit of fame. We stocked our ships full of British beer and bullets. We mobilised the navy and we called up the marines. We sailed 2 weeks till we reached the Falkland Islands, so we could teach a lesson to those bloody Argentines.
South Georgia, by all accounts, is an island of little importance for anyone but the whaling industry. It lays 800 miles from the Falklands, its much more famous neighbour, and 8,000 miles from London. Its original claim to fame was through its use as a whaling hub, though the last station had ceased operations in the 1950s. Since then, its only inhabitants had been the British Antarctic Survey, or BAS. It was perhaps this lack of importance that meant that in the 1970s, the British government used it as a testbed for peaceful cooperation with the Argentine government before beginning to tackle the issue of ownership of the Falklands. In 1978, an Argentine scrap metal merchant, Constantino Davidoff, bought the rights to scrap the South Georgia whaling stations from the Scottish company Christian Salvesen, a contract valid until March 1983. Little action was taken, however, until December 1981. In December 1981, Davidoff, aboard the Argentine icebreaker Almirante Irizar, surveyed the abandoned whaling station at Leith. However, he failed to notify the Falkland Island government of his plans, and the sudden appearance of an Argentine Navy ship caused considerable concern. While the British weighed up their response to the trespass, Davidoff was invited to a meeting with the Argentine Navy in January 1982, in which he was promised whatever support he needed to fulfill his contract. Shortly after, a number of flights by Argentine C-130s began to be sighted over the island of South Georgia. On February 9th, the British ambassador in Buenos Aires issued a formal protest, quote, in the strongest terms, at the violation of British sovereignty, and warn against the undesirable consequences which could follow from a repetition. And also, quote, if any further attempts were made to land at Grytviken or elsewhere in South Georgia without proper authorization, the British government reserved the right to take whatever action might be necessary, and that it was up to Senor Davidoff to comply with the laws of the Falkland Islands. The Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded that they had received the protest and that they had rejected it on February 18th. February 23rd, Davidoff calls the British Embassy and apologises personally for the trouble caused. He states that he intends to return to South Georgia soon after to fulfil his contract, and anxious to avoid another incident, asks for full instructions on how to proceed. The British ambassador informs Davidoff that the instruction would be arranged but would have to be written up by the Governor of the Falklands, Rex Hunt, and he would receive them sometime in the near future. On March 9th, Davidoff calls the British Embassy once again, and informs them that he and 41 workers were to depart for South Georgia on March 11th, aboard the Argentine Navy vessel, the Bahia Buensa Queso. Despite not yet receiving Rex Hunt's instructions, he told the embassy that he expected work to take 4 months, and that in order to smooth tensions and as a gesture of goodwill, his men would be at the disposal of the BAS stationed on the island, as well as the doctor and the nurse who would be accompanying him. The British Embassy passed on the information to both Rex Hunt and the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, or FCO. The embassy also asked for additional information about the ship and the composition of the work party, though it's unclear if this information was ever provided by Davidoff. On March 16th, Christian Salvesen contacted the British government and informed them that Davidoff had sent notice that they were to begin work, and they had also issued an extension on the contract to March 31st, 1984. March 19th, Rex Hunt receives a frantic call from the BAS commander at Grytviken, Steve Martin. The Bahia Buensa Queso had entered Leith Harbour without announcing its presence to Grytviken. A quote, sizable party of both civilians and military personnel, led by an Argentine lieutenant commander, later identified as Alfredo Estes, had come ashore. The sign warning against unauthorized landings had been, quote, defaced. The Argentine flag had been raised and shots had been fired. A BAS team near Leith, led by Trevor Edwards, had made contact with Davidoff's men and informed them that they should have reported to Grytviken before landing, but they were falsely told that the British Embassy had already given them permission.
It was absurd to suggest that they didn't know what they should have been doing. Davidoff knew perfectly well that he should have landed. at Grytviken first, and so did the captain. As a naval captain yourself, you would know that the Argentine captain must have been aware of the normal formalities of going into South Georgia, and so I was all for sending the Endurance down.
March 20, the FCO receive a message from Hunt relaying what the Bass had informed him. Fearing what was occurring was a repeat of the takeover of Fool in 1976, Hunt ordered the Bass to make contact with Davidoff's men once again, and order him and his men to lower their flag and report to Grytviken to request permission to land on South Georgia. Martin was also given the choice to evict Davidoff and his men once they reported to Grytviken, as this was the second time he had failed to follow protocol. The Bass team near Leith made contact again, this time with the captain of the Bahia Buensa Queso, Briatore, and delivered this message, quote, "You have landed illegally at Leith without obtaining proper clearance. You and your party must go back on board the Bahia Buensa Queso immediately and report to the base commander at Grytviken for further instructions. You must remove the Argentine flag from Leith, no military personnel are allowed to land on South Georgia, and no firearms are to be taken ashore." Hunt also chose to alert Captain Barker of the HMS Endurance, the Royal Navy's Falklands and Antarctic patrol ship, to prepare to leave for South Georgia from the Falklands to deploy its on-board Royal Marine contingent, led by the 22-year-old Keith Mills, though the FCO put this plan on hold as they thought it was too big a step to make this early on. The Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs were contacted by the FCO, who told them that, quote, "The incident was regarded as serious, and that, if the Bahia Buensa Queso didn't leave forthwith, the British government would have to take whatever action seemed necessary." Though, at this point, the British were unsure if the Argentine government were behind this, or if Davidoff had been acting as an overzealous patriot. Late in the evening, Captain Barker was once again contacted and told to prepare to leave for South Georgia, and to take additional Marines from the Royal Marine Falklands Garrison, Naval Party 8901.
Before that, the officer of the day, as I recall, had come in drenched, his oilskins, his fur weather jacket, and he'd either been virtually submerged in the boat coming in with the usual gale of wind, came in with a rather soggy bit of paper which said, "Sail forthwith."
It was at that stage that the governor and the captain of the ship, I assume in conjunction with the United Kingdom government, formed a plan that the Endurance would go back to South Georgia with a view of either encouraging these Argentinians to have their passports stamped or evict them.
And the first I heard about it was when our driver, Murray Patterson, came downtown to see us, and I was actually coming out of the toilets, and he came up to me and said, "Brum," which was my nickname then, he said, "We've got to go back to camp, we've been recalled." And this was probably about, I don't know the exact time, but you've got to be looking at about between 10 and 11 o'clock at night, something like that. So we'd all had a few beers by that point. And he said, "We've been recalled back to camp." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "There's a problem down South Georgia." And I said, "Right." I said, "Where's South Georgia?" So we had the new platoon weapon sergeant with us, and he came into the bar and said, "Right," quite stroppy really. He said, "Right, whoever's drunk, you better sober up real quick." He said, "We've got a situation down on South Georgia." And then he walked out.
March 21, in the early hours, someone broke into the Argentine State Airlines building in Port Stanley on the Falklands and replaced the Argentine flag with a British flag, writing, quote, "Tit for tat, you buggers," across a desk, and, quote, "UK OK," across two of the building's front-facing windows. Later in the day, the Bass checked on the status of Davidoff and his men at Leith once again. While the flag had been lowered, there was no sign of preparations to leave. They reported that they estimated around 50 to 60 Argentines present, and most were in civilian clothing. They hadn't seen any weapons, but shooting had once again been heard, and they had seen reindeer which had been shot dead, something strictly prohibited in Davidoff's contract. With the impression that the Argentines weren't planning to leave at all, Endurance was told to set sail for South Georgia. Meanwhile, the British ambassador in Buenos Aires finally got a statement from the Argentine government. While not apologising for the incident, they assured them that any military involvement was unofficial and no military arms were in use. The salvage party and ship would be leaving the same day, and they hoped that the situation would not be, quote, exaggerated. March 22nd, the Bass reported that the Bahia Buenca Queso had indeed left Leith, and there was no sign of the salvage party. The British government concluded that the threat of escalation was over, but further landings would probably occur in the future, possibly on the Falklands themselves. There was also debate as to whether Christie and Salverson should be forced to revoke the contract, and whether they should register Davidoff as an Argentine agent. The Argentines contacted the FCO and informed them that Davidoff's men had now left, but that in their rush they had to leave their equipment behind. They stressed that Davidoff was just a civilian who got carried away, and this did not reflect official Argentine policy. As the issue now appeared resolved, Endurance was ordered once again to return to its normal duties, unless further developments occurred. Further developments did occur only a few hours later. Late in the day, the Bass reported sighting Argentines at Leith, and a French yacht, the Cinque-Garde entering Leith Harbour despite being ordered to stay away. The Freedman crew of the yacht later claimed that their yacht had been damaged in a storm, and that they needed to carry out urgent repairs, but they made no attempt to contact the Bass. At sea, Captain Barker overheard a transmission from the Argentine Navy headquarters to the Bahia Buenca Queso, congratulating the men aboard for a, quote, successful operation, before ordering them back to Buenos Aires for debriefing. The British ambassador contacted the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and got an admission that there were indeed still men ashore at Leith. Upon hearing this, the decision was made once again to deploy Endurance, though it was to await further instructions once it entered South Georgia waters, and not to deploy its Marines. March 23rd. Steve Martin reports that there is now an estimated 10 Argentines at Leith. Ministerial approval is given to Captain Barker to deploy his Marine contingent to remove them. Intelligence reports indicated that the Argentines had no serious intentions to escalate the situation, and they would most likely fold at the very last second in order to prevent conflict. Escalations were, however, continuing, with the submarine contingent based at Mar del Plata being put out to sea, though their destination was unknown at this time. By this point, MPs in the British Parliament were beginning to ask questions about what exactly was going on in the South Atlantic, and diplomatic efforts began to be increased. The British ambassador in Buenos Aires informed the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs that because there were still men present at Leith, despite Argentina telling them otherwise, the British government had no choice but to, quote, conduct an operation correctly, peacefully, and as low a key as possible, the regrettable result of Senor Davidoff's own irresponsibility. The British ambassador had 2 further meetings the same day. The first with Enrique Ross, Vice Minister at the Argentine Ministry for Foreign Affairs, in which Ross demanded an explanation for the vandalism of the LAD office at Port Stanley, but also requesting that an operation to remove the men at Leith be reduced to a, quote, more realistic proportion to, quote, avoid exaggeration. The ambassador then met with Dr. Costa Mendez, a senior Argentine diplomat and the civilian face of the Argentine military government. Mendez expressed concern that the situation was escalating rapidly, and if the Marines from Endurance were used to evict the men at Leith, then he and the, quote, moderates in the Argentine government could not stop the military hardliners from taking harsh action. At the end of the meeting, a plan to de-escalate was established. Mendez promised to propose using the Bahia Buenca Queso to evacuate the men, and that in return the Endurance should not take any further action. Endurance was ordered to hold in Grytviken Harbour, and Lord Carrington, the British Foreign Secretary, personally let Mendez know that both he and the British government supported his efforts, and the British ambassador informed Carrington in turn that Mendez had responded well to his message, and he believed that he had a genuine desire to avoid conflict. Mendez contacted the ambassador that evening, and told him that the proposal had been discussed, and while the Bahia Buenca Queso could not be rerouted back to Leith, another ship could be sent in the coming days, though this would have to be discussed with the military. March 24th, Endurance arrives at South Georgia. It first positions itself near Leith to check for any developments before moving to its holding position in Grytviken Harbour. After reaching the harbour, the Marines would establish a 4-man observation nest on Jason's Peak overlooking Leith, but the rest of the Marines would stay aboard the ship. Costa Mendez contacted the British ambassador and told him that the chances of their plan going into action were good, but that they were still waiting for a final decision from the commanders-in-chief. As the day went on, however, the situation deteriorated rapidly. At the meeting of the commanders-in-chief, Admiral Anaya, the head of the Argentine Navy, objected to the plan due to the presence of Endurance at South Georgia. Coincidentally, around the same time, the British government received intelligence saying that the events that had been unfolding were almost certainly the doing of Anaya and the Argentine Navy, and they were in fact acting almost entirely independently of the rest of the Argentine government and military structure. They also received a much more dire warning from the British Defence Attaché in Buenos Aires, who alerted the British Ministry of Defence that he was aware that any attempt by the British to remove the men at Leith would result in violence, either in the form of an attack on the ship removing the men, or even possibly in the form of a raid on the Falklands to rescue the men from detention. March 25th marked the tipping point of the crisis, after which the Argentines had decided to end the matter militarily. Early in the day, Endurance was alerted to the deployment of Argentine warships to the South Atlantic to intercept it, and to provide security for the men at Leith. Later in the day, Endurance reported that a new ship, the Bahia Paraiso, had arrived at Leith and was beginning to offload cargo and men using military landing craft and a helicopter. The ship itself was flying the flag of the Argentine Antarctic Squadron. Lieutenant Mills decided that he should get a look for himself, and he travels along with his Sergeant Major Peter Leash via Gemini to Olsen Valley, before climbing up to Harbour Point 600 metres above Leith, where he saw for himself the Argentines at work offloading men and material. Then Captain Barker decided that he too should see for himself, and taking one of Endurance's 2 Westland Wasps flown by Commander Tony Ellerbeck and Lieutenant Wells, he lands at Tonsberg Point and the 3 men link up with Mills and Leach. However, the captain of the Bahia Paraiso, Trombetta, is alerted to a British helicopter flying around, and he decides to take his Alouette, flown by Lieutenant Besson, to see the British. Upon seeing the Alouette take off, the 5 Brits decide to leave. However, not before Besson hovers above the group, and Trombetta makes a universally recognised hand gesture. Lord Carrington reported these developments to the British Cabinet, and assessed that there was a very real threat to violence if action was taken against the men at Leith. In fact, the situation was so serious in the eyes of the British, that the US was now brought into the fold, and told that the British government was, quote, bound to take action to restore the status quo. The British ambassador met with both Ross and Mendes, and both had pointed out that there was now no way to defuse the situation without appearing to have surrendered to a single British ship. A desperate plan was formed to get Davidoff to appear at Grytviken and receive false documents allowing him to land at the Falklands. Then he was to feign ignorance as to the fact that these did not allow him to land on South Georgia, apologise, and then begin his salvage work. When Mendes was informed of the plan on the evening of the 25th, he responded that he liked the idea, but he would have to get the permission of the President, as this was now an important matter of national prestige. He would, however, try to report back the same evening if possible. The British Ministry of Defence reported that the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs appeared to be cooperating in cooling the situation. The Argentine Navy, however, acting in its own interest, was still escalating, now having deployed 2 Exocet armed frigates to the waters between the Falklands and South Georgia. On March 26, the Bahia Paraiso left Leith, but there were still men ashore, and they had been left with a large amount of stores, and they appeared to be digging in for a long stay. Galtieri, the Argentine president, calls a meeting with the commanders-in-chief to discuss the situation. What exactly is said is unknown, but the FCO is now under the assumption that negotiations have failed, and the Argentines aren't going to leave without some sort of a confrontation. Lord Carrington decides that Endurance should move to evict the Argentines, but afterwards transfer them to an Argentine ship off South Georgia, as opposed to detaining them. The US was to mediate, and the first mentions of a task force are made, but they're rejected at the current stage. The outgoing garrison of the Falklands will be kept on the island alongside their replacements until the crisis is over, and a support ship was to be prepared to assist the Endurance. The defence plans for the Falklands are updated, budgetary constraints are now removed, and the decision is made to deploy a nuclear-powered submarine to the South Atlantic. However, there's still doubt that if the Falklands is invaded, whether the British could deploy troops that far from Britain to take it back. March 27th, Costa Mendes, despite his assurances to the British ambassador, appears on Argentine TV and announces that a firm decision has been made to give full support to the men at Leith and offer them, quote, all necessary protection. In press coverage following the announcement, it suggested that there either were or had been Argentine Marines aboard the Bahia Paraiso, a ship the Endurance had now lost sight of. The British ambassador pressed Ross for any information about the ship, but he didn't get any answers. Though Ross did tell him that the decision to support the men at Leith was not unanimous, and there was still debate ongoing. The British Ministry of Defence also received a message from the naval attaché in Buenos Aires, who had compiled various reports from the Argentine press, reporting intense activity at the Puerto Belgrano naval base, whilst Marines were being embarked onto transports. March 28th, the British ambassador receives a formal letter from Mendes decrying the British response to the situation and reiterating that Argentina saw the Falklands and South Georgia as its own territory currently under occupation. The British ambassador concludes that most solutions were now off the table, and reports to the FCO that he believes there was no intention to ever resolve the dispute peacefully, and that the Argentines had successfully stalled the British long enough to prepare and put their navy to sea. The Bahia Proviso is sighted 15 miles off the north coast of South Georgia by Endurance. At this moment, it's believed there are around 18 Argentines at Leith. In the evening, there's frantic exchanges between Carrington, Prime Minister Thatcher, and the Americans. They conclude that the Americans should approach the Argentines, with an offer to either get British permission to carry out the landing, or to be evacuated by a neutral third party. March 29th, the deployment of a nuclear submarine to the South Atlantic is approved. The submarine earmarked was the HMS Spartan, and it was to set sail the next day. Given the worsening situation, a second submarine was to be sent soon after. The support ship, RFA Fort Austin, was also to set sail from Gibraltar to resupply the Endurance, that at this point only had 3 weeks of supplies remaining. The British Ministry of Defence also debated sending a number of destroyers that were based at Gibraltar, along with the Fort Austin, but decided against it. Reports from the Argentine press were passed on to the British ambassador. There were now 5 Argentine warships in the South Atlantic, heading for South Georgia, and that all leave for naval personnel had been cancelled. The deployment of so many ships had proven incredibly popular with the Argentine population, and the fervour was now so intense that there was growing doubt that even the Americans could talk them down. The British Ministry of Defence had also now received intelligence indicating that the Argentines were preparing some sort of landing in April. Argentine Special Forces teams had been deployed to scout out possible landing sites, and an amphibious task force was being prepared. The British assumed that the Argentines would land a small force, gauge the response from the UN, and then reinforce them with a task force. March 30th, there was now confirmed to be 5 warships and a submarine heading for South Georgia, and reports were coming in of at least another 4 ships having left Puerto Belgrano after them. Argentine naval personnel were now confined to their bases, and work crews were hurrying to mount missiles onto ships. In the afternoon, the British Ministry of Defence convened a meeting and discussed the Argentine deployments. It was noted that another Argentine task force, including an aircraft carrier, 4 destroyers and an amphibious landing ship, had been detected 800 miles north of the Falklands. However, confusing matters was the fact that the Argentine Army and Air Force had yet to raise its own readiness, or react in any substantial way to the ongoing crisis. Carrington okayed the deployment of a second nuclear-powered submarine to the South Atlantic, and was debating sending a third in the near future. He also scheduled a meeting for the 1st of April to discuss the formation of a task force to send to the South Atlantic. The Argentines informed the British ambassador late in the day that they had outright rejected the advances of the US in attempting to mediate, and that the British should simply allow the men at Leith to get on with their salvage work and reopen negotiations on the status of the Falklands. However, the British believed that this was a temporary raise in tensions, in order to discourage domestic opposition, and negotiations may be restarted in short order. March 31st, in the morning, Carrington informed the Argentines that a special diplomatic mission would be sent to Argentina to try and settle the matter more efficiently. However, this was mostly a tactic to present a preferable alternative once the Argentines learned of nuclear-powered submarines heading their way. It was reported to the Ministry of Defence by the naval attaché that at this point almost the entire Argentine navy was at sea, and the Argentine press was riling the population up, calling the deployment of British submarines a threat. Costa Mendez even weighed in, telling the Argentine people that, quote, "the group on South Georgia is on Argentine soil." In the early evening, Defence Secretary Knott was briefed by the Ministry of Defence that the Argentines planned a major military operations in the early hours of April 2nd, the most likely target being the Falkland Islands. An urgent meeting is held in the House of Commons led by Knott and attended by the Prime Minister and a number of government and military officials. During the meeting, a message to President Reagan was drafted, in which they requested he personally contact the Argentine President Gualtieri, and asked for an assurance that he would authorise no landings or hostilities by the Argentine armed forces. And in return, Reagan was to pass on Thatcher's assurances that the British would not escalate or begin any conflict themselves. At this meeting, the Chief of Naval Staff set down the size and composition of a task force that would be capable of retaking the island, and was ordered to prepare it immediately, though with no commitment yet as to whether or not it would sail. On South Georgia, the Endurance landed its 22-man Royal Marine contingent, and its entire stockpile of infantry equipment and ammunition. They barracked themselves in Shackleton House, and Endurance got back out to sea, figuring it would be safer in open ocean than hanging around in Great Viking Harbour. Back in London, the FCO informed the British ambassador in Buenos Aires and the governor of the Falklands of this development, and stated that the only people who were to be informed by them of this was the garrison commander on the Falklands and Captain Barker of the HMS Endurance, who was to be ordered at once to return to Port Stanley. That evening, the British received intelligence that the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs had essentially ignored Carrington's message, as they had decided that the absolute minimum they would accept from the British would be an immediate restart into negotiations on the sovereignty of the Falklands, and that there be no more talk of the Argentines on South Georgia. Mendes had also informed the Argentine government that the UN was split on who to support in the event of a landing. However, this was now coming in too late, as Argentine Marines were preparing for the landing. April 1st, the British ambassador in Washington, D.C. met with the US Secretary of State. The American claimed that both he and his government were completely unaware of the Argentine intentions. Despite this, however, at a 9:30 meeting, the British cabinet agreed that their last best hope for de-escalation was through the intervention of Ronald Reagan. Also in the morning, the Ministry of Defence concluded that all the British could do now was hope for the best. They concluded that they had unintentionally weakened themselves, and at this point they could only take a reactive role, since they had assured the Americans that they would not escalate the situation in return for their support. In the early afternoon, Reagan contacted Thatcher to inform her that he and his government were doing everything it could to de-escalate, and that they were very concerned about how fast the situation had deteriorated. While the Americans worked behind the scenes, however, the British ambassador in Buenos Aires received a final ominous written statement from Mendes, stating in no uncertain terms that the time for negotiations had ended, and Argentina would now do as it pleased on South Georgia. By the evening, reports were reaching London from the defence attaché and the ambassador in Buenos Aires that mobilisation was underway. Aircraft were being prepared to airlift troops in the south of the country, and enough ships and troops were being assembled in various ports to indicate a major operation was underway. The FCO, Rex Hunt, and the ambassadors in Washington, New York, and Buenos Aires all received intelligence stating that the Argentine task force would arrive off Port Stanley the next morning. The US ambassador finally spoke with President Galtieri, who would not say outright what he had planned, but he told the American that the British needed to begin talking with Argentina regarding the surrender of South Georgia and the Falklands. Despite this, Reagan assured Thatcher that he himself would contact Galtieri. With the end of the day fast approaching, the British government received intelligence that an attack was imminent. However, they estimated its arrival on either the 3rd or 4th of April. It was also concluded that the decision to invade had already been made towards the end of March, as the British had been trying to de-escalate. That night, Thatcher held a meeting with Carrington and Knott. The armed forces were to be put on alert, and the task force was to be formed within the next 48 hours, on 4 hours' notice to set sail for the Falklands thereafter. They would be met at Ascension by a handful of destroyers, currently based at Gibraltar. April 2nd, in the opening hours, the Argentines refused to answer to anyone. The American Secretary of State couldn't reach Mendes, the Argentine ambassador in Washington had been summoned but was yet to arrive, and even the Vatican was trying to reach President Galtieri. At 2:45, Reagan contacted Thatcher and informed her that, quote, President Galtieri had spoken in terms of ultimatums, and had left him with the clear impression that he was embarking on a course of armed conflict. At 9:45, in London, Thatcher informed the cabinet that the invasion appeared imminent, with Knott reporting that the Argentine amphibious troops were on immediate alert. However, it was decided that it wasn't yet time to deploy the British task force.
You're listening to the Falkland Islands Broadcasting Station, and now here is His Excellency the Governor.
Good morning. It is with the deepest regret that I have to report a complete lack of response from the Argentine government to the Security Council's call to refrain from the use of force against the Falkland Islands. As a last resort, and at our request, President Reagan spoke direct to President Galtieri a little while ago to urge restraint and to offer to send Vice President Bush to Argentina. Galtieri replied that he appreciated President Reagan's concern, but if the UK did not agree tonight to recognize Argentine sovereignty over the whole of the Falklands, with provision for transfer within the next few months, they would take whatever action was necessary. Argentina considered that it had full freedom to use force. The idea of a mission by Bush was rejected. Now, it is difficult to see what further steps we could take to deter the Argentines. I therefore have no alternative but to declare a state of emergency with immediate effect under the Emergency Powers Ordinance of 1939. Under these emergency powers, I can detain any person, authorize the entering of any premises, acquire any property, and issue such orders as I see fit. Now, I have no further news about the Argentine Navy Task Force, but may I just say that the morale of the Royal Marines and the FIDF is terrific, and it makes me proud to be their Commander-in-Chief. That's all for now. I'll report when anything has been observed.
You are back with the studio here again now. We will, of course, repeat his governor's message in about 5 minutes' time.
And of course, Rex Hunt came on later and declared a state of emergency. Well, I'd only ever seen that on films before. The Falklands were mobilising, ready for war, but again, you're still thinking, surely not. Surely this isn't going to happen. And then about sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, Pat Watts came on and said, Patrick Watts, the Argentine fleet has now been sighted off Cape Pembroke, and there are landing craft approaching the Narrows. And then you could sort of hear some firing in the background. And then the next thing I know, everything goes off air. And I looked at Pete Leach and he looked at me and we said, holy shit.
Helplessly, we listened to the awful news of the invasion. The whole thing was a monumental cock-up. We were stuck out there in mid-ocean, too far away to defend Stanley, and with our Marines now stranded without support on South Georgia, at Grytviken.
At midday, the RS Bransfield, a Bass ship, reported the announcement on the Falkland Island Broadcast Service that Argentine forces had landed. The invasion was simultaneously reported by the US State Department, from the Bass at Grytviken, and from the cable and wireless operator in Port Stanley. At Leith, Lieutenant Commander Estes assembled his troops, and he gave them the good news. The Argentine national anthem was played, and the flag was once again raised over what the Argentines called Isla San Pedro. Upon hearing of the landings on the Falklands, Lieutenant Keith Mills summoned his men and informed them that it was time to prepare for a battle. A number of the men had seen the news coming for a few days, especially after a Soviet ship had been seen poking around. Fortunately for the Royal Marines on South Georgia, April 2nd had seen a Force 11 gale blown across Ireland, giving the men at least a day to prepare for the landing. Around 9 AM, the Bahia Paraiso arrived in Cumberland Bay from Leith in order to radio the Bass station. They informed Steve Martin that they would arrive at Grytviken the next day with a, quote, very important announcement, before returning out to sea. As the Marines began to prepare a defence of the island, Mills contacted the UK via HMS Endurance to ask for new orders. Though he knew it would be at least 6 hours or more before he received them. Aboard Endurance, meanwhile, knowing that hanging around the Falklands was a surefire way to either get sunk or captured, and getting quite sick of what he called being buggered around, Captain Barker chose to attempt naval guerrilla warfare, planning to return to South Georgia and use the island and its many bays to cover the launch of its helicopters as they raided Argentine shipping.
If your men, there was a real and very, very grave danger that the Endurance would have been sunk, how would you feel about that? Would you have been prepared to have taken that risk?
Oh, of course. And I was going to take any number of risks at that stage to either take on the opposition with whatever arms I had, which was pretty limited. I could use her to ram, for instance, a tanker, and their ships, because they couldn't exist without fueling every 2 or 3 days, had to have a tanker with them. And I would have rammed the tanker, and I would have put AS-12 missiles, which were the ones that we carried, through their other ships.
And you would have risked the whole ship's company to do that?
I would have to have fought my way out of it.
The Marines decided to dig in on the slight rise just behind the collection of buildings that made up King Edward Point. This put them within 20 metres of the shoreline. The men from Endurance on the right flank, in a peat bog, and the men from Naval Party 8901 positioned on the left around Shackleton House. Attempts were made to use a JCB digger someone had found, but the conditions meant all the preparations had to be done by hand. One Marine, Les Daniels, was ordered to prepare the jetty for demolition and rigged it with 200 pounds of plastic explosives, as well as old harpoons scrounged up from Grytviken, nuts, bolts and screws. Daniels, alongside Marines Porter and Church, also buried half a pound of explosive every 6 feet on the rock beach. Having no detonator on hand, the impromptu minefield and demolition job was wired up to a household 3-pin plug, to be simply plugged into one of the outlets in the buildings and flicked on when given the order. While the construction was underway, Mills finally received his new orders in the late afternoon.
And the message says exactly, word for word, when the Argentinians make radio contact with you tomorrow, you are not to cooperate. And I thought, what does that mean? Does that mean I turn the radio off? Or does that mean I don't comply with whatever wish they come up with or whatever? And I said to Pete, this doesn't make sense. So I quickly encoded another message, and it said, this one is, again, word for word, your last message is ambiguous. Please clarify. So sent that one off. Knew again it would be some time before it came back. The guys are still digging in. We're thinking about what our options are.
The response came back later in the evening. Quote, when asked to do so, you are not to surrender. But only a little while later, this order was amended. Quote, the OCRM, Officer Commanding Royal Marines, is not to take any action endangering life, leaving Mills still unsure about what to do next. The reaction to these orders was mixed. The men from Naval Party 8901 were clearly ready for a fight, angry that they hadn't had a chance to fight alongside the rest of their unit on the Falklands, while the Marines from Endurance were much more subdued. With all the preparations they had time to make finished, the men retired to Shackleton House, with Corporal Thompson, one of the men from 8901, describing the situation as, quote, being like on death row. While waiting in Shackleton House, the men of Naval Party 8901 were working themselves up into a frenzy. One Marine, Brass O'Hare, going as far to take Roald Amundsen's ice axe from the wall and pledging to kill an Argentine with it, saying, quote, when I run out of rounds, I'm going to bury this in the first man who comes over the top of my trench. Thompson pulled Mills aside and outlined what he planned to do with his men. Quote, don't even think about surrendering. You cannot put your gun down and walk off as though nothing ever happened. You will never live it down. We stand here and we fight, and once we start losing blokes, we'll all die here. End of story. April 3rd, the weather that had prevented the Argentine landing the day before had cleared, and the bay was completely still, with no noticeable wind, and waters so still as to act like a mirror. The OP on Jason's Peak, manned by Marine Nigel Peters and 3 others, reported sighting an Argentine warship, the ARA Guerico, exchanging supplies and men with the Bahia Paraiso. The Guerico was a French-built light frigate, armed with Exocet missiles, a 100mm gun, and a 40mm AA cannon. Sergeant Major Leach returned the men to Grytviken using a Gemini, and upon their return, the final briefing was held between the Marines and the Bass, where it was agreed that the majority of the Bass personnel would wait in the Grytviken church, well away from any potential danger. But 3 would travel to St. Andrews Bay to join 2 wildlife photographers who had been on the island since the beginning of the year, and were completely unaware as to developments. It was also decided that once the Marines had bought themselves some time, they were to conduct a fighting retreat through Grytviken, collecting the Bass personnel on the way, and pull back to Marviken, where they would begin staging raids against the Argentine garrison. The Marines then went about their final preparations, and just before 9:30, Steve Martin, who had stayed behind with the Marines to communicate with any Argentine demands, took probably the most recognisable photograph of the South Georgia Marines. Less than a minute later, the Marines heard a helicopter approaching, the Alouette, piloted by Lieutenant Besson, who had been tasked with scouting King Edward Point to see if there were any British military personnel ashore. After 10 minutes of flying over Grytviken and the point, he returned to the Bahia Paraiso, where he reported no signs of military activity. Following this, around 10:30 a.m, the Bahia Paraiso and the Guerico entered Cumberland Bay. The captain of the Bahia Paraiso and the Argentine Antarctic Squadron, Trombetta, contacted Steve Martin at the Bass Station to demand the surrender of the base. Quote, I have an important message for you involving the successful operation by Argentine forces at the Malvinas. The ex-governor surrendered the islands and its dependencies unconditionally, and I suggest you do the same. Martin decided to stall Trombetta to buy as much time as possible for Mills and his Marines. First, he read back Trombetta's message as slowly as possible to confirm, before asking for time to consider. Then, by sabotaging his reply on his primary radio, before switching to the backup high frequency set, which could be heard at range, alerting Endurance to the beginning of the invasion.
This is Endurance. I assume that you can hear me. Rules of engagement are as stated earlier this morning. Defend if you are provoked. Over.
Though Mills would never hear this command due to poor weather at sea, Argentine shipping in the South Atlantic heard it loud and clear and began closing in on Endurance. Lieutenant Mills told Steve Martin to join the rest of the Bass personnel at the church and took over negotiations to attempt to stall for time. Unfortunately for him, the Argentines would only give him 5 minutes. In a final attempt to give him and his men some more time to prepare and for Endurance to reach South Georgia, he revealed that there were Marines stationed on the point. However, whether the Argentines simply ignored him or just didn't believe him, they carried on with a plan to take Grytviken. Sometime between 11 and 11:30, the Argentines sent their final message to order all the presumed BAS personnel to line up on the beach and surrender. With it clear that negotiations were over, and with the sound of another helicopter approaching, Mills, accompanied by Daniels, stepped out of the BAS building and headed to the jetty to meet a landing party they assumed would come from one of the two ships. They saw the Guriko pass slowly in front of them, before making a wide turn in the harbour and passing back out into the bay. With their gaze fixed on the ship, they failed to realise that Bousson's Alouette is now coming in to land. 23-year-old Marine Robert Ashton tracked the helicopter as it came in on the beach, but was told to hold his fire by the nearby John Stone Street. Mills and Daniels turned to locate the helicopter, only to see that it had landed only a couple dozen metres away. Lieutenant Guillermo Jorge Luna and 6 Marines had dismounted and were securing the landing site, when one of the men spotted Lieutenant Mills.
I failed to see another Alouette helicopter coming in and landing and disembarking several Argentine Marines only about 80 or 90 yards from literally where I was standing. And I thought, this is not looking good. You know, the RGs are literally, they've now got feet on the ground, on the peninsula. I was still unclear exactly as to what I was meant to be doing, because don't surrender, but don't do anything which might endanger life. So I thought, again, I'll try and make contact with these guys. So I sort of stood there, put my hand up, and the first 2 or 3 guys who disembarked didn't see me, but the 4th one did. And I never forget the look on his face as he looked over and saw me in full combat kit, sort of with my arm up. And he tapped the guy in front of him, who looked at me and began to sort of turn and bring his weapon to bear. And I thought, right, that's it, I'm out of here. So,
as Mills and Daniels rushed back to their trenches, the second Argentine helicopter, a Puma, approached the King Edward Point landing pad. It was piloted by First Lieutenant Alejandro Villagra, and he was carrying 15 Marines.
Come up from Grytviken, I suppose, along the shoreline. Suddenly, he's right up, nose up in the air, braking hard, effectively. And I thought, well, what's this? Well, you know, there was so much noise.
I seem to think it was Al Larkin, one of my corporals, shouting, "Sir, the helicopter's about to land. What do you want us to do?" And I thought, well, I've done what I can to prevent there being bloodshed now, but I can't do any more, because if there's 18 guys in that helicopter, if they get out at such close range, and there's only 20 of us, 22 of us, and there's guys already on there, we're in trouble. And I'd always been taught through training that you always use the word fire when you want people to engage the enemy, but I must have watched too many John Wayne movies, because I just remember shouting out, "Hit it!"
Either Bob Ashton or Al Larkin fired the first shot of the Battle of Grytviken, followed within microseconds by the rest of the Royal Marines. At least 2 of the Argentine Marines were killed instantly, and several more wounded, but despite this, and damage to the engines, Villagra managed to limp the helicopter over to the far side of the harbour and put the helicopter down. Despite most of the attention going to the Puma, a number of hits were also made on Bousson's Alouette as it returned to the Bahia Paraiso. Unsure what to do, Lieutenant Luda ordered his men to start moving to capture Shackleton Ace. When they were only about 90 metres away, Corporal Thompson orders his machine gunner, Brassoer, to open up and the Argentines scatter. Ordered back in by Trombetta to provide fire support, the Guriko returned to the harbour, and with the helicopter down and the Argentines hiding behind the buildings, all attention is focused on the Guriko. It attempted to open fire on the Marines with its 40mm gun, but after only half a dozen shots it jams. When the ship closes within 500 metres, Mills orders his men to open fire once again. In the following minute, thousands of rounds are fired at the Guriko. Marine David Combs fires off a Carl Gustav launcher. The round falls short, but since the conditions are so still, it skips across the bay, hitting the ship in the waterline, killing at least 1 Argentine and causing severe flooding. A rocket from a 66mm launcher also manages to take out the 100mm gun. Another rocket hit the hull, and Steve Parsons, a Bren gunner, manages to hit a group of Argentine sailors trying to clear the 40mm cannon, killing at least 1. Despite this success, the Royal Marines also took their first casualty at this point, with Corporal Nigel Peters being badly wounded after being hit in the shoulder and arm by an Argentine in one of the buildings as he tried to fire his launcher. The Guriko, however, now needed to escape the harbour, necessitating running the gauntlet a second time. With the bridge cleared, its captain, Commander Alfonso, ordered the Guriko forward, As the rest of the Marines reloaded their weapons, Peter Leach ran into Shackleton S, climbed the stairs to the second floor and rushed to the end of the building facing Grytviken. Using the butt of his rifle, he broke out the glass of a corner window, dragged a table into the middle of the room. Armed with an L-42A1, he lay down on the table, and as the rest of the men opened up on the ship once again, Leach began firing carefully aimed shots at the vessel. He directed his opening rounds at the 5 windows across the front of the bridge. At this point, only Captain Alfonso, the helmsman, and the quartermaster were manning the stations as the glass began to shatter. The 3 men were forced to crouch on the ship's floor to avoid being struck by the rapid succession of shots and the broken glass. As the Greco moved out of sight of this position, Leach ran through the building to another window and repeated the process, shooting out 3 more windows. With the Greco almost back into the bay, Combs also managed to get one more hit on an Exocet launcher with Carl Gustav. The Greco had escaped the harbour after sustaining over 1,000 impacts. The fighting died down for a while as all the available targets had been taken on by the Royal Marines, but the Argentines were using this as an opportunity to change their tactics. Using the Alouette, Besson was beginning to ferry men over to Grytviken itself, in order to surround King Edward Point. Some men already in position were setting up machine gun positions, and firing almost indirectly at the Marines. And by 12:25, the Greek was also back in action. Stationed firmly out of range, it began to shell the point with 100mm shells. At this point, having proved their abilities, and with the life of one Royal Marine on the line, Mills made the choice to put an end to the fighting. First trying to raise an Arctic camouflage jacket with a rifle as a makeshift white flag, this was met with machine gun fire. A few minutes later, Mills grabbed the jacket once again and stood up in view of the Argentines. He put down his gun and walked down to the beach when an Argentine came out of cover to meet him halfway. Luckily for him, the Argentine spoke English.
And I said to him, I said, look, we're in a pretty difficult situation here, as you can see, but not quite as difficult as the situation you're in. I said, because my guys are so determined to see this out, I guarantee that if this battle continues, not only will we die, but you guys are going to be coming with us.
Did you get that feeling from, your
Oh,
Marines
yeah.
that they wanted to
Oh,
continue?
yeah. When I announced that I was going to surrender, they were not happy. Very difficult. I remember Pete Leach saying, why are we surrendering so? We're winning hands down. Well, we were winning hands down at that moment in time, but we wouldn't be winning hands down an hour later if it had continued.
Mills waited with the Argentine for the arrival of a Stees, after which he ordered his men out of the trenches and to put down their weapons. While the Argentines that Mills had spoken to seemed relieved that they weren't going to have to spend any longer pinned down on the beach, and the newly arrived Argentines who had watched the loss of the helicopter and the crippling of a ship were on edge. What began as a sweep of the trenches became a sweep of Grytviken, which became a sweep of the surrounding hills, as they couldn't believe that there'd only been 22 Royal Marines, and they believed that some must have fought the way out towards Maiviken after all. After finding nothing but a large 2-handed fire axe in Brassower's trench, and a cold and miserable Steve Martin in a ditch between Grytviken and King Edward Point, they ended the search. Mills and his men were lined up on the beach and surrounded. The Marines were searched and knives and other equipment were seized, including more than one knife and a hand axe from Brassow. A nearby officer then called out an order, and 2 machine gunners appeared and sat up and loaded their guns only a few metres away from the group. Very aware of stories like the Great Escape, glances were exchanged between some of the men, and some muttered about attempting to charge at the gunners, expecting to be executed any second. Though, recognising the tension about to boil over, Mills approached the officer.
Again, luckily the Argentinian officers there were very understanding. I said, if your guys don't step back from those weapons, then my guys are going to make a charge because they think we're all about to be shot here. And they understood and actually told their guys to stand up so they weren't actually literally lying right behind them, finger on the trigger, because it would only take somebody to sneeze, you'd have thought, for carnage to have ensued. So with that, I think the Marines were all...
As a gesture of goodwill, in exchange for the guns being taken away, and having decided it was probably in everyone's best interest not to be stored on hundreds of pounds of explosives, Mills informed Estes of the impromptu minefield and demolition charges, and had Daniels undo his handiwork. After this, the Royal Marines and the Bass personnel were transferred over the course of the afternoon and evening to the Bahia Paraiso. Peters was seen to by an Argentine doctor, and then the rest of the men were held in cabins below the flight deck under guard. By this time, Endurance had actually arrived once again off South Georgia, and nestled into one of its many bays.
The very first part was watching Keith. We flew ashore that morning, and we arrived just at the end of the battle.
So you actually witnessed...
we witnessed the boats going in to
yeah.
pick Keith up. And we had the Greco lying down below us, wounded, with oil pouring from her. She'd made a slow curve into the bay at this stage, and we then watched this and then went back to report.
Barker addressed his disappointed crew, saying, quote, "We're outside range of the Argentines at the moment. In fact, we're a lot closer than my directions have allowed me to be. We're supposed to be 150 miles from South Georgia, but as you can see if you look out, we're a lot closer to South Georgia than that. My directions are not, regrettably, to go into Grytviken and zap the Argentine frigate Garico, which we could well have done this morning whilst we're at anchor. But my orders were not to fire unless we're provoked, and well, maybe we're provoking them by being here, and if we do provoke them, we'll give them as good as we get." After this, Endurance set course away from South Georgia to link up with the inbound British task force. The next day, the Bahia Paraiso docked at Rio Grande. The Marines and Bass personnel were transferred to Bahia Blanca Naval Base, where on the 15th, Mills and Peters were questioned to no results, the Argentines only learning the pair's name, rank and serial number. On the 16th, they were flown to Uruguay, and handed over to British Embassy officials, who had the men flown back to the UK on the 19th. On the 25th, South Georgia was retaken, with the Argentine submarine Santa Fe being crippled after attacks from a number of British helicopters, including the 2 Wasps from Endurance. On 30th April, Endurance evacuated the last of Grytviken's Bass personnel and the wildlife photographers from St Andrews Bay. Back in England, the South Georgia Marines were given a short leave before being redeployed. The men from Naval Party 8901 rejoined their unit and went on to take part in the recapture of the Falklands, while Mills and his men first went to Ascension, where they would guard the Argentine prisoners taken during the recapture of South Georgia, including Estes and other familiar faces, before returning to Endurance, stationed at Grytviken on the 25th of May, via the requisition cable ship Iris. The Marines from Endurance would go on to take part in the recapture of Southern Fool on the 20th of June, going ashore with Marines from 42 Commando, and accepting the Argentine surrender in the Endurance's boardroom, making Endurance and its Marines possibly the only men to fight in both the war's opening and closing action. So I got to the end of editing and I realized I hadn't recorded an outro for this video. So I just want to say thank you if you made it this far. I appreciate the support, especially to the Patrons who waited so patiently. The sources, as always, like the last video, will be on screen right now, as you can probably see. And yeah, apologies that it took so long to come out. At first this was only going to be a 20-minute video, and it ballooned into a 50-something minute epic. But I really wanted to do this story justice, because no one had ever bothered to write the whole thing down before. And in the course of trying to write the whole thing down, I think all the drafts came to something like 30,000-40,000 words, and I've probably put 200-300 hours into this project now. So I had to see it through. I couldn't just, drop it when it started running overdue. But yeah, thank you for watching. The next one should be out sooner.